The lost generation, who are they? These are people who were better known for their existence during the war. The term lost generation appeared in the period between the two world wars. It describes a generation of people who were born in the late 19th century, early 20th century and whose youth fell during the First World War. This term came from Gertrude Stein. She called them people who fought in the First. The lost generation is defined as the cohort born from 1883 to 1900, those who grew up during the war and went into service, those who lived through a stormy 20 years. Around 20 million people died worldwide and about 20 million more were injured. The war left a deep mark on their psyche. They experienced the horrors of trench life, the loss of loved ones, the collapse of ideals. They could not find themselves in a peaceful life. The values that they were instilled with in childhood had become devalued. They were disappointed in a society that, in their opinion, had done nothing to prevent the war. They felt alienated from their peers who did not fight. Ernest Hemingway, Eric Maria Remarque, Gertrude Stein, these are writers who have had a great impact on that generation. In their works, these writers expressed a sense of disappointment, alienation, and the search for the meaning of life. The Great Generation, also known as the Generation of Soldiers, formed from 1901 to 1927. Most of the representatives of the Great Generation are the parents of the Silent Generation and the Baby Boomer Generation. The first person to use the term Great Generation was James Van Fleet in 1953. As of 2023, approximately 1% of the Great Generation remained alive. This is about 119,500 people from 16 million Americans who served in World War II. The Great Generation is not just people whose existence fell on a period of wars. This is a generation of heroes who stood up in the face of adversity, defended their homeland, and laid the foundations for a peaceful future. Peaceful life did not bring them the desired peace. The world they fought so desperately for seemed alien and incomprehensible to them. The Great Generation is a generation of heroes that will forever remain in our memory. And representatives of this generation are already over 90 or 100 years old. Silent Generation. This is the generation that was after the Greatest Generation and precedes the Baby Boomer Generation. They were formed from 1928 to 1945. According to the United States, as of 2019, there are only 23 million people from the Silent Generation. The silence of this generation speaks louder than any words. The historical incidents of those times are the Great Depression in the 30s and the Second World War in the 40s. Because of such a crisis, there was a very small population of this generation in the world. But despite their taciturnity, they also stood up for their civil rights. Today, most representatives of the Silent Generation have already crossed the 90-year mark, but their influence on the world is not weakening. They continue to be opinion leaders. Baby Boomers Generation. This generation is called the Baby Boomer Generation. They followed the Silent Ones and precede Generation X. This generation was formed in 1946 to 1964 during the baby boom. By their characteristic name, you can understand what is inherent in them. During the time of the baby boomers in the 1950s and 1960s, there were many reforms in all areas. A great economic growth has begun, various technologies have begun to appear, which are now very well developed in our time. Their cohort has evoked a very specific culture around them. As I said before, the baby boom generation speaks for itself. Their time had a very large increase in population. This is due to the fact that there were post-war years, people were focused on rebuilding the population, a new healthier generation was growing up, they had a healthy psyche, they began to live at a different time, they had greater benefits than their ancestors. Generation X are people born between 1965 and 1980. They found themselves in the shadow of their predecessors, the baby boomer generation, and the predecessors of their children, Generation Z. Generation X is a generation that combines the experience of the past and the dynamism of the future. Like ghosts gliding between epochs, Generation X eludes clear definitions. Their childhood was washed by waves of change, and their youth was overwhelmed by the storm of the 90s. They witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the USSR, and the rapid development of technology. In a period of change, in the 70s and 80s, when social values were changing, Generation X, as children, often found an empty house after returning from school. They became owners of the key, a symbol of independence at a young age, which gave them the name Generation of Lopics. Some of the many cultural influences on the youth of Generation X included the spread of musical genres with strong socio-tribal identities such as alternative rock, hip-hop, punk, post-punk, rave, and heavy metal, in addition to later forms developed by the representatives of Generation X. Millennials, also called Generation Y or Gen Y, make up the demographic cohort that follows Generation X and preceding Generation Z. Millennials in the United States make up a relatively large portion of the country's population, unlike their counterparts in most other developed countries. What influences the economy and geopolitics of the country? But Americans who came of age in the 2010s were less religious and sexually inclined than their predecessors. William Strauss and Neil Howe created the theory of how generations, and in 1987 they coined the term millennial, given that the oldest members of this demographic cohort had come of age around the turn of the third millennium AD. In their books Generations, A History of America's Future from 1584 to 2069, 1991, and the Millennial Uprising, the Next Great Generation 2000, they wrote about this cohort. Due to the significant increase in the birth rate from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s and the large size of their generation. Compared to the boomer generation, millionaires are sometimes called echo boomers. The birth rate in the United States peaked in August 1990, and the trend towards the decline in the number of families in the developed countries of the 20th century continued. This is the generation of millennials who have also been described as the first generation to grow up on the internet. The Zoomer generation is often abbreviated as Gen Z. This is a generation of people born from 1997 to 2012. It corresponds to the theory of generations developed by I.L. Howe and William Strauss. The members of the generation are called Zoomers, Centennials, Homelanders, Pluralists, IGeners, and the New Silent Ones. Representatives of Generation Z actively use 3D reality, tablets, and smartphones. At a conscious age, people can access the internet practically anywhere and at any time using your mobile phones, smartphones, or handheld devices. Many people think that Generation Z and digital man are synonymous. Generation Z is interested in art, science, and technology. For example, researchers predict that many representatives of the generation will be engaged in robotics, biomedicine, and engineering disciplines. In addition, Generation Z is the first generation born during the time of globalization and postmodernism. Many parents from Generation Z work part-time or even take on the responsibility of working from home to devote more time to raising their children. Security issues are at the center of public attention. In Japan, Generation Z is called Neo-Digital Aborigines and Generation Y is called Digital Aborigines. Digital Aborigines mostly communicate by text or voice, whereas non-digital Aborigines use video telephony, and other means of communication. This highlights the transition from text format to video format and from PCs to smartphones to the non-digital generation. Alpha Generation. The term Alpha Generation is used worldwide to describe the generation of people born from the early 2010s to the mid-2020s. The Alpha Generation is the first fully born generation in the 21st century. It was named after the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Most children of the Alpha Generation are millennials, less often Zoomers. During the birth of the Alpha Generation, the birth rate in many countries of the world decreased. Smart technologies, social networks, and streaming services are becoming increasingly dominant elements of children's entertainment, while interest in traditional television is declining. Compared to previous generations, this generation received earlier training due to changes in the use of technology in classrooms and other areas of life. According to research, allergies, obesity, and other health problems, screen time-related issues have become increasingly common among children in recent years.